Good morning, everybody. Oh, you all survived the snow, give or take. I was out shoveling it this morning. I should have shoveled it earlier in the week because this morning it was like shoveling wet concrete. It was terrible. But I enjoyed the snow for the day or two that we had nice powder. Have just one or two announcements for you. I think just two. One, I want to let you guys kind of know what is going on downstairs. We are not doing the slide. Can you click in the projection software, and maybe that'll do it. We'll try it this way. No. There we go. Yeah, you're like, oh, okay. So directly underneath my office, like that entire area behind there is like that big classroom downstairs. That now is completely floored. And the old tiny like cuddle room nursery, that's completely floored, and two of the classrooms on the other side are completely floored. And it looks really good. It looks so, I forgot what it's like to have flooring in the church. And so it looks really good down there. They've got one more classroom on the floor right below us, and then the hallways, I guess they do that last. They do the classrooms, and then they go through and match it on the hallways. And then they're gonna move down to the lower floor and start the flooring there. We've realized there's a couple issues with our toilets, so we're gonna have a plumber come sort all that out. But it's almost like I can taste the end of the line. And so if you guys wanted to, it's still a little chaotic down there, but you can walk down and see what the flooring looks like if you want to see it with your own eyeballs. I'm just so thankful that this is occurring and happening. We will at some point in the next 2 or 3 weeks need to gather some arms and legs after church because we've basically just stored random things downstairs in varying classrooms, and we're going to need to switch those things around and throw some things out and move some things upstairs and move some things. We just need to shift. It's Tetris, and so we will need some help with that. But I think we could probably get it all done within an hour after church. I just don't know what day we're going to need to do that. I want to wait till the flooring is all finished. So that said, the flooring is half-ish way in, third way in, and that's super exciting. We also have our worship, I don't know, maybe my battery's dead. Have our worship online, so James, if you don't mind hitting the next slide for me, there we go. ktnnaz.family/worship will get you all of our worship slides for our worship songs for the week, and pretty much anything else that you guys want to connect with us on is at ktnnaz.family/links, and so I'm restarting my software so that we can have notes to follow along with. And then we're gonna read a little bit of a passage we're gonna read later today, but we're gonna read the last half of it now. We'll read the first half of it later. It's backwards, but it works. I think it kind of suits the song that we're gonna sing this morning. Psalm 104 is an immensely beautiful psalm about God's authority and his creation power and how he provides for the entirety of creation. And starting in verse 24, it says this: "O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all, and the earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea great and wide, creeping things are innumerable in there, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things. When you hide their face, they are dismayed. When you take their breath away, they die and return to dust. When you send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. May the glory of the Lord endure forever. May the Lord rejoice in his works, who look on the earth and it trembles, who touches the mountains and they smoke. I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have being. May my meditation be pleasing to him, for I rejoice in the Lord. And so this morning, as we sing a song about God's glory and his hand in creation, may the last line of that psalm be something that we take to heart this morning. May our meditation be pleasing to him as we rejoice in the Lord this morning. So if you take whatever posture is comfortable for you in worship this morning, we'll be singing Indescribable. We're going to kind of hit on these ideas today of God's authority over creation. And it's kind of a passage that we wouldn't necessarily attribute to this topic, but nonetheless, I think Mark is very, very intentional when he chooses the passages that he chooses, and he puts them in the place that he puts them in Scripture. We're going to be at the tail end of Mark chapter 4 today, and then into chapter 5. And by and large, it's two stories that we're familiar with. It's the story of Jesus calming the storm when the disciples are in the boat and they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to die, and Jesus is napping. And then he wakes up and he's like, hey, don't worry about it, I got this, where's your faith? And this is typically a story that we use when we want to preach about how we should have more faith, how we should trust Jesus even in the difficult times, how we shouldn't be concerned with what our eyes see and what our body feels, but more concerned with how is Jesus acting in this moment? And if Jesus isn't concerned, then maybe we shouldn't be concerned. And I think that's a great perspective from this passage. But there are always more ways to dive into Scripture than just the one way that we're used to. So when we look at that passage, the story of the storm, and we combine it with the story that is right on the heels of it, Jesus arriving on the other end of the shore and meeting a man who is possessed by legion, as it's called in the story. We see that these two stories are actually quite similar, and they tell the same story in different contexts. And so we're going to read them today and find out what Mark would have to say to us. But just as a reminder for those of us that have short-term memory, the Gospel of Mark was written to demonstrate that Jesus is the Messiah on a mission to draw all people to himself. That's the whole point of Mark. It's why he wrote it. It's why he chose the stories he did. And up to this point in the Gospel of Mark, like 90% of what we've covered so far in the first 4.5 chapters has been focused on the latter half of that. That the mission of the Messiah is to draw all people to himself. So everything that we've read thus far has been primarily about the all-encompassing welcome that God has for people. That he intentionally chooses to find friendship and fellowship with tax collectors and sinners. And he wants to go to their house and have a meal with them. And he doesn't do that with the Pharisees. He does it with those who are, quote-unquote, sinners of the day. He's not bothered when folks who are disabled bust through the roof and interrupt his teaching. That's just a normal day for Jesus. In fact, he finds those moments to be particularly special because his welcome is so large, he wants the people who have been excluded from worship to be included in worship. And so he welcomes them right in, and he gives the marginalized people places of forgiveness and community and places to explore faith where otherwise they wouldn't have been able to. He called the first disciples in the beginning parts of the Gospel of Mark, and these were uneducated Torah school dropouts. These were the, rough around the edges, average Joe, wasn't smart enough to get all the way through Torah school so that they could go and kind of learn under a rabbi. They had maybe a 6th grade education. They were going to do what their dad did, which is what their granddad did, which is what their great-grand did. They were just normal, everyday people. And Jesus didn't go to the synagogue and choose the A-plus Pharisees. He went to the seashore and chose your average Joe who probably didn't know how to math very well. And I'm thankful for that because I find myself in that position. And so he continually welcomed people that others wouldn't and gave them positions of leadership in the church, the body of Christ. He also verbally taught that God is generous and consistently provides good seed opportunities everywhere and all the time. And that's the story that we read last week. And today's section isn't going to highlight necessarily the all-encompassing welcome of Jesus. It's going to focus on the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. We got a little bit of that at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. where we saw the baptism of Jesus and the Holy Spirit descended like a dove, and the voice of the Lord spoke through the clouds and said, "This is my son with whom I am well pleased, listen to him." And so we get the idea at the beginning of Mark that Jesus and God have this very unique and special relationship of father and son. But now we are going to revisit this idea of the authority of Jesus and the Messiah-ness of Jesus in these two stories. And I think that these two stories highlight, one, the authority of Jesus, but two, humanity's potential responses to the authority of Jesus. These two stories give us a great perspective of who God is and the variety of ways that people react to God. And I think Mark, I don't know for certain, but when I read this, I think Mark left it open-ended for a reason. I think he left some questions in these passages so that when we are done reading them, we wonder what we would do. Some stories get tied up with a nice bow at the end, and you feel completed having read them, and it doesn't necessarily make you question stuff because it was tied up with a bow. These don't necessarily do that, and so at least for me, they left me wondering, what would my response have been in these particular situations? And that is kind of what we want to look at this morning. We're going to read Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35, and we're going to go through 5, verse 20. Jesus stills a storm. On that day, which was the day he talked about sowing seed everywhere, when the evening had come, he said to his disciples, "Let's go across to the other side." So leaving the crowd behind, and remember, he had been teaching them from a boat in the cove of the sower. So he was already on a boat in the water. He said, "Let's leave the crowd behind and go to the other side." So leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in a boat just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, and the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him up and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, he rebuked the wind, and he said to the sea, "Be still, be silent." And the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Chapter 5. They came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately, again, that's a theme in Mark, the immediacy of things, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him in any way, not even with chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day he was among the tombs and on the mountains. He was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of this man, you unclean spirit." And then Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" And he replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. Now there on the hillside was a great herd of swine that were feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine. And the herd, numbering 2,000, stampeded down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherders ran off and told it in the city and in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus, and they saw the man that was possessed by demons sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they became frightened. Those who had seen what had happened to the man possessed by demons and to the swine reported it, And they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. And as he was getting into the boat, the man who'd been possessed by the demons begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown to you." And the man went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everybody was amazed. These stories are so interesting to me. Very rarely, I think, have I heard the man possessed by legion story preached, and I'll tell you why. It falls under one of the categories that Jesus has the authority over that we don't like to touch. He has authority over the wind, we get it. He has authority over the waves, totally cool. The weird, people are uncomfortable with it. Even Christians are uncomfortable with the weird. I know pastors that will never preach this kind of thing because they don't know what to do with it. They are weirded out by it. It is a weird story, let's be honest. This is bizarre. There's a lot in here that I want to ask God about one day, and it's not really even theologically relevant questions. I want to know, what about those swine herders? Like, that was their entire livelihood. Those pigs were gone. They had nothing. They would get in trouble. They could be killed for that. Like, what about the incidental bystanders in this story? These are the things that I think about when I read Scripture. What about the little guys that nobody ever talks about again? I feel bad for the swine herders. And so aside from that, Jesus has this authority over the wind, the waves, and the weird. And I think we need to acknowledge that. The stories basically cover all of creation, these two stories. They cover the earth, which would be the things like the waves, the things that we touch. And it covers the heavens. That would be the wind that comes and goes that nobody really knows the beginning or the end of. And it covers the unknown and the unexplained and the mysterious, the unseen things that happen around us. And I think Mark included these stories to cover the full spectrum of the authority of Jesus, because if he only said God has authority to still the wind and still the waves, what about the weird stuff? What about the stuff we can't explain in our lives? What about the things that truly frighten us because they are so big and so unknown? Does God have authority over those things? And I think these passages are in there to teach us that God does have authority over the things that we might not be able to fully understand. And it's okay that we don't fully understand them, so long as we can understand that God has complete authority over these things. The prevailing view of the day was perhaps that Jesus was a prophet, a good man, who came to tell people how to behave so that they could earn God's pleasure. That's kind of what the Pharisees would have wanted, like, fall in line, Jesus, teach what we teach, don't rock the boat. And he was not that guy. He was not the guy who was going to teach people how to behave according to the law to earn God's pleasure. That's not who Jesus was. He was not a priest who would fall in line with the sacrificial system of the day and just do sacrifices day in and day out and day in and day out on behalf of the people. He wasn't even a king that came to lead an army and overthrow the Romans. The general people of the day would have wanted that of Jesus. He was not those things. He was, however, the prophet who would come and declare that the kingdom of God is now and at hand. He was the priest who would himself be the sacrifice, the once and for all. He had the authority to do that. He was the king who came not to overthrow, but to usher in with love and grace. This was the kind of person Jesus was, the physical embodiment of the living God. Man became God, became man. It's a mishmash of humanity and deity, a 200% being, 100% man, 100% God, smushed together in one being, unlike any other thing that has ever existed. And he has authority over all of creation, all of the seen, all of the unseen, all of the known, all of the unknown, all of the things that we can touch and taste and feel, and the things that we can't. The Jesus that walked the face of the earth, the Jesus that Mark is telling us about, the Jesus that calmed the storm. Any of you familiar with the North Sea and how bad the waters are there? No. The only reason I know is because on TikTok, there's like this rabbit hole you can get down that's North Sea TikTok, and it's got this really creepy sea shanty that they put over all the videos. And it's of these like massive shipping, like barges, like these massive cross-ocean barges stacked like 10 high, and I mean, you know, the big, big boats. And they have cameras on these boats. And I gotta say, it's the most frightening thing when those massive shipping boats are going all the way up and then smashing down, and waves are cresting completely over the top of them. I am scared of water, and I am terrified when I watch that. In this story, the Sea of Galilee, which they're boating on in arguably not a very large vessel, the geography of the land around the Sea of Galilee lends itself to these massive storms on the sea that really rival oceanic storms in terms of waves that can be 15, 20, 30 feet high in the Sea of Galilee. Think of it kind of like our landlocked Great Lakes, and how they are large enough that they have tides and that they get massive waves that can upend boats. It's like that, but it's the Sea of Galilee in the area of Israel. And these people are born and raised on the Sea of Galilee as fishermen. And they have been in a million storms. And it's this particular storm that they think they're going to perish. The waves have completely overtaken the boat. There's really no place for them to hide from it. And then Jesus is just sleeping. He doesn't care. He's just sleeping. Ultimately, because Jesus has the authority over everything, I can't imagine that the boat would sink with Jesus on it, but the people didn't know that. I don't think that they realized at this point that the Jesus who was asleep in the boat is the Jesus who literally, at the beginning of time, called forth the waters from the deep and separated the waters from above and below. And he put some of them on the earth, and he put some of them in the firmament. And as the ancient Jews would understand, the waters would be above the dome and below the dome. And that was how they would understand it. This is the God who did that. The God who was taking a nap in the boat is the God who separated those waters. This is also the God who, at the beginning of all of the creation of earth, once he had separated those waters from above and below, he then caused a wind to go across the face of the earth and kind of separate the earth waters so that there would be dry land spots. And he made the seas with his wind. He gave borders to the water with dry land. And this is the God who is asleep in the front of the boat. This is the God who, when not wrapped in human form, dwells in a realm of completely unseen glory. One that our eyes have not and probably cannot see without losing our ever-loving minds. God is in an unseen realm surrounded by creatures we can't imagine, who worship and serve and love him day in and day out. And they are so unknowable to us that in the times in Scripture when God just kind of peels the veil back just a little bit for, say, John, when he sees into the heavens in Revelation, or some of the prophets in the Old Testament who got little glimpses of the glory of the throne room of God, they can't quite put to words what they see in the heavenly realms. It's like a giant ball with wings and eyeballs on all sides, and there's these rings around it, and it's hovering, and it's praising God, and they're trying so hard to explain the unexplainable, because it's weird. It's weird because it doesn't exist here in a place that we can see and understand it. The God that was asleep in the boat is the God who sits enthroned whose throne is literally held up by the seraphim, the ones with the wings. And he is the God who created the very earth on which we dwell, the ground on which we walk. He is also the God that created all of the stars out in the sky, the ones that go beyond what our scientific knowledge can explore at this point. There is stuff even beyond what our telescopes can see. And when we send satellites out, and NASA has sent these great little like long distance space traveling devices with cameras all the way out, right? And even beyond what those can capture, there is more. And we can't see it. We don't know it. It is unknown and unexplained. And in that, there is a little bit of fear, because some people wonder what is out there. That's how I feel about the bottom of the ocean. We actually know more about space than we do about the ocean. That's fascinating to me. I'm more terrified about what's in the ocean than what's out in space, because it's closer to me, I think. I saw someone dropped a GoPro on a rope off a cruise ship while it was in port. Not here, it was, I think, in the tropics based on the fish. But they dropped it down and immediately terrified, because inky, dark abyss. But there were so many creatures just underneath the cruise ship, ones that I'd never seen with my eyeballs before. And then they caught a great white shark, which was really cool. One fish got really close. It was maybe like a barracuda, but I don't think it was. Long and streamlined and scary, like a sword almost, if you just picked it up by the tail. And it had this massive eyeball, and it swam right by the camera, and you could see this massive eyeball just staring into the camera, and then it went by, and I don't even know how big it was. It could have been this big. A GoPro's not big. Or it could have been like 10 feet long, and I really have no idea. But it's down there, and that scares me. There's unknown things that I am terrified about, and somehow in my faith, I have to wrestle with the fact that the God that I know and that I love is also the God that made things are terrifying to me, and are beyond my comprehension. I will never understand why God made those spiders in Australia that are the size of dinner plates. I will never understand why those exist. I have questions. The God that I know and love, that's full of grace and mercy and welcomes everybody, made some things that are terrifying and that are beyond understanding. Job used to be one of my least favorite books. It's slowly over time becoming one of my favorite books in the Bible. And near the end of Job, there's this couple section chapter. It's like 38 through the end of the book, where Job and God have this conversation. It's an interesting conversation where Job kind of flexes a little bit, and God puts him in his place. Gently but firmly, God asks him a series of questions just to kind of level the playing field, to remind Job who has the authority over the heavens and the earth, the seen and the unseen, the known and the weird. And the questions read something like this. Where were you when I built the earth? Can you shut the sea with doors? Can you command the dawn to change its colors? Have you seen the gates of death and the gates of darkness? Have they been revealed to you? I like this one. Have you seen where I kept all the snow, the storehouse where I keep it? Have you seen it? Can you change the direction of the stars or their placement in the heavens? Here's where it gets weird. Can you make Behemoth and approach it? God said this about Behemoth. It was the first of my great acts, and only I can slay it. Now I'm terrified by that. What the heck is that? If I were Job, I would back down at this point, because we don't know what Behemoth is. We postulate. We try and put it in things that we understand. maybe it was a brontosaurus, right? Maybe it was a T-Rex. We think about things that we already know and understand and can classify. And yet God says about Behemoth, you can't even approach it. There's no getting close to it. It was the first of the great acts that I did. Somewhere in the history of all of God, not necessarily the history of our planet, one of the first great acts of God was to make Behemoth. And the only power in all of heaven and earth that can stop it, confront it, control it, contain it, direct it, is God. He continues at chapter 40 by talking about another creature. He asks Job, can you pull Leviathan from the depths? Can you hook it with a hook around the nose, and can you make it obey you like a pet? God's a little sarcastic in these questions. He's trying to get up under Job a little bit and say, there are some things your mind, you can't conceive of. There are things that are too big for you to handle. There are some weird things you can't classify, and yet I made them. I have control over them. I can make Leviathan my pet. I can tame him. If you really want to, you could read Job chapters 38 through 42. You would see the description of Leviathan. That his eyes are like the flashing of the morning dawn, and his back is like metal shields, and they are so tightly packed together that not even light can get through them. And in his fearsome mouth are teeth, and his nostrils spit smoke, and out of his mouth comes fire. And we get this image of, most of us kind of picture a dragon, some sort of dinosaur-esque creature, but we don't know what it is. We're just guessing. We've never seen it. It's a weird creature that is probably more fearsome than anything we've unearthed in archaeology. Because I don't know that, I think there are just some things that God made for himself that are just glorious. The psalmist wrestles with this idea as well. We read a little bit of Psalm 104 this morning. I'll read a little bit more of it. In Psalm 104, he is wrestling with what God has authority over. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord, my God, you are very great. And here's a beautiful little image for you to stare at while I read this. You are clothed with honor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment. You stretch out the heavens like a tent, and you set the beams of your chambers on the waters. That's the waters above the dome, by the way, in the Jewish understanding. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. You make the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. You set the earth on its foundation so that it would never be shaken. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, and at your rebuke they flee. At the sound of your thunder they take flight. They rose up to the mountains and ran down to the valleys, to the places you appointed for them. This is kind of detailing out what creation would have been like when God separated the waters from the waters. You set a boundary so they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth in the valleys, and they flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. Wild donkeys quench their thirst. By the streams, the birds of the air have their habitation, and they sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains, and the earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. The God that we serve, I'm afraid that sometimes we make him too small. I'm afraid that sometimes we want him to look so much like us in an attempt to try and understand him that we bring him down to our level And then we have made something in the image of ourselves that is no longer God. That's why the disciples were scared in the boat. Jesus was just a guy. He had some great things to say, but they didn't realize that the guy in the boat was not like them. He was God. He was the one who separated the waters from the waters, and he was the one who probably knew that Leviathan was somewhere in the deep there, just hanging out. And if he said, "Here, boy, come here," Leviathan would come right to the edge of the boat. And I think sometimes we make God in our image instead of letting us be crafted in his image. And we make him too small and we fit him in a box, and we think that he can only have the authority over the things that we might have the authority over. I can control the temperature of a building. I cannot control the weather of the earth. And that's where my spectrum of authority ends. And God's spectrum of authority has no end. It is without end, eternally. John's gospel also speaks to this. And I've got it on the screen, so I don't have to dig it up too far. But it says this about God, Jesus, the one in the boat who was sleeping. "In the beginning, the Word was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and life was the light of all people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overtake it. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him." Talk about a weird paradox. He was living in the thing that he brought to life. And the world did not know him. He came to his own, but his own people didn't accept him. But to all who would accept him, who would believe in his name, he gave power to become the children of God, who were born not of the will of flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And this is John trying to wrestle with what Job was wrestling with and what the psalmist was wrestling with and what the disciples hadn't quite figured out how to wrestle with, that the one in the boat is the one who has complete and total authority over everything, including the weird things that we can't quite figure out how to name and we don't fully understand. Because when we get to the story about the man who is possessed, a lot of us go, "That's weird." And even within Christianity, there is a kind of a mindset of uncertainty about those passages. There are many people who go, "Well, that's not really possessed. That's just probably epileptic." I've heard that preached. Or it's some form of mental illness, schizophrenia, or something along those lines. And, we weren't there. We don't know what that was really like. What we do know is that this man was clearly uncontainable, and everyone was scared of him. And he hung out among the dead because that was the only place he could be. And Jesus wasn't scared of him like everybody else was scared of him. In fact, what I love about this story is of all of the people in these two stories, the crowds, the disciples, the religious leaders that were invariably there because they're nosy, and the man who was possessed by Legion, only one person in this whole section of stories recognizes who Jesus is. And it's the man who's possessed. He's the one that comes running up to Jesus and says, "Please don't interact with me, Son of the Most High God. Just go on your way. I do not want this." But he is kneeling in front of Jesus. He is acknowledging Jesus has the authority. All the other disciples, all the other people are very confused by what is going on here. There are multiple responses to Jesus' authority in the weird ways. The first is what we see in the disciples in the boat. The first response is kind of this fear or shock that the disciples have. Who is this guy that the wind and the sea obey him? That's where that story ends. So if you just preach that story alone, it ends with a question. They were filled with fear, and they asked one another, who did we just let in the boat? Who is this guy? Why? What else can he do? Maybe we don't want to cross him. There's probably a lot of things going on in the mind of the disciples in that moment, and they are filled with fear because in the greatest storm of their life on the boat, Jesus was just like, be calm, and it was done. And they were scared. They recognized the event happened, they were there, but they were worried what else he might do. If he can do that, what else might he do? And the disciples were concerned, rightfully so. The next response is found in chapter 5, verse 14. And it says this: humanity's response towards Jesus' authority, curiosity. After the swine dumped themselves into the water, the swineherders went running off and be like, y'all never going to believe what happened to all of our pigs. The crowds came to where Jesus was. They came to see what had happened. This is the bulk of the world. People are curious when something weird happens. People want to know the weirdness and be a part of it. They want to experience it. On NPR this morning, there was a story, and it's weird, but people want to participate in the weird. There is someone had laid some concrete down, some fresh concrete, and marked it off so people didn't walk through it on the sidewalk. But a squirrel, at some point, had jumped out of a tree and landed in the wet concrete, then got up and ran away, and there was a perfect, squirrel impression dried into the concrete. And whatever this location is in Chicago, there is now a shrine to cement squirrel. People are leaving cheese offerings, and the story was just so bizarre to listen to this morning because it was weird. And they interviewed someone, and he said, I had to come and see it before it became monetized or too crowded to get to. Because it was weird and people wanted to see it. They were curious. Cement squirrel. Now, I'm curious too, and I'm going to Google what that looks like later, but, obviously can't get to Chicago, but that's what the crowds were doing. They heard that this random dude showed up on the edge of the water, had a conversation with the guy that scares the snot out of everybody in the local 10 towns, and then a bunch of pigs jumped into the water. And they were like, okay, we're going to go see what happened. We're curious. Everybody just flocked to the edge of the water to see Jesus. The people came to see what it was that had happened. And when they got there, they saw the possessed man sitting, clothed, clean, and in his right mind. A couple things about this response. One, there's safety in numbers. If you aren't certain about what is happening around you, you hang out with a crowd. You stay with the majority decision. You go with the flow. These people are interested, but they are not committed to Jesus, right? So the disciples were initially scared of the power that Jesus displayed. One of the first times they'd seen this power. He'd forgiven people. He'd made lame people walk. But this was bigger with the waves. They were scared. The crowds were curious. They were going to come and see, but they weren't going to stay. Very few, if any, probably hung out afterwards. The crowds flocked, and then psychology books will tell you, sociology books will tell you, there is a crowd mentality that takes over. That when there is a large crowd, if one person starts to drift away, the crowd will just follow, and they won't even know. One time when I was I went to Disneyland when I lived in California with a college group, and there was this long line wrapped around the Matterhorn ride. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is a really long line. So we were walking to find the front of the line to see how much it was wrapping around this kind of round ride that you could, When we got to the front of the line, it was just a dude standing in front of a trash can that was using the trash can as a table while he was having a snack. People just lined up, and because there was a line starting and more people lined up in that line, people were waiting in that line forever and no reason, simply because that's what the crowd was doing. Certainly, if there's a line, there must be something interesting happening. This is kind of what happened with the curiosity. They came, they saw what happened, and then they moved on. That's a response to Jesus' authority. The next response is just 3 verses forward. The ones that stuck around a little bit, they rejected Jesus. So you've got the people who are scared, the people who are curious and then leave, and then the people that aren't just curious and leave, the people who say, we are so uncomfortable with what you represent and how things are going around you. You disrupt the status quo so much. We actually want you to leave. We don't want you here anymore. You make us feel uncomfortable. Your brand of weird is beyond what we can take. So this is what they said. When they saw the man clothed in his right mind, they became frightened. Those who had seen what happened to the man possessed by demons and to the swine reported it, and they began to beg Jesus to leave. I can't conceive of that. Like, I don't understand that. Why, if Jesus is in your midst, why would you beg him to leave? But these people are so terrified of what Jesus is capable of that they say, nope, you got to leave. And I think this is something that we commonly do and we don't realize we do it. Generally speaking, outside of the world of faith, if we don't know something or if we can't understand something, then the easier path is just not to have it in our life. It's too complex. I don't want to deal with it. That's how I feel about math. I had to take math in school. Once I was done with those required math classes, I don't understand it. I don't want a part of it. I'm not dealing with it. Now I have a calculator. It does my math for me. That's as close as I get to math. I reject it. Wholeheartedly reject math. The easier path for me is never to do math. If we can't make sense of something, if we see something with our eyes that does not seem to fit our realm of how the world should be, rather than sit with the tension of that, we will just reject it and pretend it doesn't exist. And rejection can look like a lot of things. It can look like direct begging. Jesus, go away. I do not want you here. That's a direct rejection. But it can also look like denial. I don't know that guy. That's Peter, right? I don't know that man. I'm not one of his disciples. And there's a rejection. You can't conceive of the fact that the Lord that he grew to love so deeply was being crucified. He was just rejecting and distancing himself from that entire event. It was a refusal to engage in something. Okay, this might have happened in front of me. I can't deny that my eyeballs see it, but I'm going to put a wall between me and that. I'm not going to let that affect me. I'm not going to let that change the way I live my life. I can't explain it. I'm going to contain it and move on. Some people, when they reject something, they will play the devil's advocate. Well, yeah, that was just a one-time thing. It can never happen again. Here's all the reasons why. I can try and explain this away. I don't understand it. I don't want to understand it. I will keep my distance from it, and I will keep my distance from anybody else who holds that view. And faith communities do this as a whole on the regular. And we don't think about it. And it's not just maybe the more obvious ones, like certain people groups that we may, as a faith group, go, I don't really want to acknowledge their existence, so we're just not going to make space for them. That happens. But we do it with theological things too, and we probably don't realize it. Take speaking in tongues, for example. What do you do with that? There's 900 billion different views on that. Ask every person, and they have a slightly different view on what it means to speak in tongues. And some faith traditions really embody that idea and say that is proof of your salvation if you speak in tongues. And other faith groups would say, listen, speaking in tongues doesn't exist today. That was just a one-time thing that happened. It was weird, it happened, we acknowledge it. That's not now. That's not how God works now. God has changed how he works. We try and explain away certain things that are in the Bible and negotiate with them, like thoughts on the end times when we read the book of Revelation. Some people read it as a holy terror book. So they stop reading it. They don't want to deal with it. They don't want to know. Other people look at it as a roadmap. What's coming down the road? There are a myriad of ways to look at the book of Revelation, and do we know which ones of them are right? No. That book's weird. I'm not going to lie. That's a very weird book. There's a lot to digest there. And people who don't want to try and figure out maybe what God could be doing in those moments go, I'm just not going to read the book of Revelation. I'm just not going to do it. Yeah. I'm good right now in the New Testament moment that I live in. I don't want to think about what's coming because it scares me. And my generation grew up on the Left Behind series, so some really solid Bible fan fiction there that, if you watch the movies, there's some pretty creepy stuff in those movies. None of that's in there, but it gives the impression of what might be in there. So you just distance yourself from it. Spiritual warfare, that's another one. That falls right into today. Angels and demons. There are a lot of Christians who do not believe in angels and demons. There are a lot of Christians who believe that heaven and hell are not existent, that those things are ideas but not realities. And even if you believe it's a reality, do you believe it is a literal place, or do you believe it is a section of time? Do you believe it is a separation from? There's a lot of ways to view that. It's weird. In fact, one of the things that I get the most when I talk to unchurched people or de-churched people is, hey, do you know your Bible's full of weird stuff? And I'm like, yeah, I've read it. You can't deny it. There's some arguably weird stuff in this Bible. And we will try and explain it away so that we can feel comfortable with it. But the weird stuff we're not meant to explain away. The weird stuff we're supposed to sit with and go, somehow God has authority in and of all of this. And a lot of the weird stuff, he's the one that's doing it. So we have to wrestle with that. So the list can go on, even to miracles. We'll explain away miracles. We'll explain away God as well. A lot of folks who claim to be Christian will have a hard time explaining God and how he relates to them and how they relate to him. He is an overall guidance for things that are good, or he is a personal savior who died on the cross for my sins, or he is an abstract idea that helps people define morality and immorality. And these exist in the realm of Christianity, all of these views, because we are trying to explain away something that is so big and so weird. And frankly, God is in the category of weird. I mean, let's be honest. Some of the things that happen in the throne room are weird, and God has designed all of that so that we would know he is bigger and smarter and more in control of the stuff than we are. The list can go on with how we reject the things that God does in our life. The last response is obedience. I really only see one person in these stories following the obedience, and it's the man who was saved from Legion. It says this in verses 18 through 20. The man begged him that he might be with him. As Jesus was getting in the boat and heading out, because, people, pitchforks and fire, and they were trying to get him to leave the town. And the man begs him, please, I want to go with you. You wrecked my life in the best way possible. I am not what I was. I don't live in the graveyard anymore. My bruises will heal. I have a solid mind. I want to be with you, the one who made me whole. Please let me go with you. And Jesus said, no. Go to your own people. Tell them what the Lord has done for you and of the great mercy of God. And I think one of the greatest examples of obedience in Scripture is this man, who then went and did that. He wanted to be with Jesus. And Jesus said, the best way to be with me is to obey me. And so the man went to the Decapolis and he started preaching his heart out. I lived in a graveyard. I couldn't be shackled by chains. I was the one you told your children about at night so that they would stay in bed after dark. I was the boogeyman, and now God has changed me. He was one of the very first evangelists. Yes, the disciples eventually got sent out, but at this point, the disciples had not been sent out. And up to this point, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus has told everyone, don't tell them what I did for you. Shh, just go about your way. Except this guy. Jesus said, if you want to be with me, the best way to be with me is to obey me. Go and tell them how good God is. And he's really the only one that responded to the authority of God in the right way. What's interesting, and I'm closing with this idea, the winds and the waves obeyed Jesus without question. There was no argument from them. A wave didn't lap over the boat and go, hey, maybe in 5 minutes. They just stopped. There was an abject, direct, authoritative statement. Jesus said, quiet, and it was quiet. We are not the waves. We push back. We have a choice. The waves didn't. The winds didn't. The separation of the sky didn't. We do. We are different than all of the other things in creation that God has authority over. And we are different because we bear the image of God. And part of that is that we have free will. We can choose. We can choose how we respond. We can choose not to respond. We can choose to reject. Free agency is our ability to determine if we will look at what God is doing around us and how we will respond to it. Will we acknowledge the authority of God around us, or will we reject the authority of God around us? Will we submit to its goodness, or will we ask God to leave us alone? Because the beauty of a God with full authority is he could make us mindless robots and obey like the waves, but he didn't. The greatest act of love from God is that he set aside a portion of his ability to control us, and he gave us free will. And he said they can choose whether or not they will respond to me and my authority. And because Jesus is the Messiah on a mission to draw all people to himself, he is the one who lovingly gives us the opportunity to wrestle with his authority, to wrestle with the implications and then decide how to respond. And I think that's why Mark put these passages in here, is because we are supposed to, at the very end of these passages, at the end of the storm, go, who is this man that the wind and the sea obey him? Creation abjectly obeys God. And then at the end of the passage with the man who was filled with legion and then freed, are we going to be the one that when God says, here's what I would have you do, choose what he would have us choose? Or are we going to reject it? Or like visit it like cement squirrel and then go about our way? Are we just going to ignore God's work in our life? That's what Mark wants us to wrestle with. Do we acknowledge the authority of God, and how will we respond to it? How does God's authority and your life intersect? And what will your response be? Because he has the ability to direct your life in ways you could not ever have imagined. But it may go contrary to what you want or contrary to what you're comfortable with. And that's where that man was at the end of the story. He wanted to go with Jesus. And Jesus said, go to the world. Are we willing to be that kind of recipient of God's direction and authority? We'll go ahead and pray, and we'll worship, and we'll let God speak to us, because this is not a distant object lesson. This is a prompting for our own decision. What kind of person will we be in response to God's authority? Lord, you are the God who we believe created all of the things that we can see and the things that we can't see. That's even in our historic faith creeds. We believe that you separated night from dark, and or day from night, and light from dark, and water from water, and you made land, and then in all of that you made things that make us wrestle with how big and glorious you are. And the more we learn about the immensity of the world around us, the greater our awe for you should be. But may we never be the kind of people who beg you to leave because we are scared of your authority, or because we do not understand it, or because we do not like it. But may we be the kind of people who, when we see something that is beyond our understanding, go running towards it and say, that must be God at work, and I want to see what he is doing. And then when we beg to stay near to you, and you say the best way to be near me is to obey, may we be the kind of people who fall at the feet of Jesus and say, what will you do with me, Lord? Because I'm willing to obey like the waves and the wind. We give you all the glory, Father. It's yours and yours alone. And all God's kids said, amen. Let's worship.